If you've ever explored African history, then you've probably come across the name Muammar Gaddafi. But if you haven't, don't worry. You're about to learn something fascinating. Gaddafi was one of the most controversial leaders Africa has ever seen. Born on June 7th, 1942, in a small Libyan town called Qasr Abu Hadi, he rose to power in 1969 and held on to it for a staggering 42 years. That's more than 4 decades of ruling Libya, until it all came crashing down in 2011. His story didn't have a peaceful ending. On October 20th, 2011, after a fierce battle in his hometown of Sirte, Gaddafi was captured and killed. But why did it happen? What led to the downfall of a man who once held so much power? Some say it was because of his iron-fisted rule. Others believe there was more to the story, something bigger happening behind the scenes. When things took a turn for the worse, Gaddafi tried to escape. He and his loyal guards hid in a massive drainage pipe, hoping to evade capture. But their pursuers, the National Transitional Council fighters, weren't far behind. When they finally found him, gunfire erupted, marking the end of an era. But was his downfall just about dictatorship? Or was there something else at play? Why was Muammar Gaddafi really silenced? Many people believe it was because of the way he ruled Libya, but the truth runs much deeper. His downfall wasn't just about politics. It was about money, power, and control over Africa's future. Gaddafi had a bold vision. He wanted Africa to break free from the influence of Western currencies by introducing a single gold-backed currency called the Gold Dinar. If this plan had worked, it would have completely changed how African nations traded their resources. Countries in Europe, Asia, and the US would have had no choice but to buy African oil and minerals using this new currency. That would have shifted economic power toward Africa, something global superpowers weren't willing to let happen. Determined to turn his dream into reality, Gaddafi pushed this idea hard through the African Union, especially during his time as chairman in 2009. His plan wasn't just talk, he was actively working to make it happen. But as his influence grew, so did the resistance against him. When the uprising in Libya began, it wasn't just about removing a dictator, it was about eliminating a man who threatened the financial order of the world. Before his death in 2011, Gaddafi endured brutal treatment at the hands of opposition forces, and when the battle in Sirte came to a bloody end, so did his life. Muammar Gaddafi had a plan that could have changed the entire economic landscape of Africa, and that made a lot of powerful nations very uneasy. His idea was simple but revolutionary: create a new gold-backed currency for Africa, the Gold Dinar. If this became a reality, African nations would no longer rely on the US dollar or the euro to trade their oil and natural resources. Instead, countries buying from Africa would have to use this new currency, shifting financial power away from Western economies. That was a threat the West wasn't willing to ignore. The idea wasn't just talk. Gaddafi had the resources to make it happen. Libya's central bank reportedly held around 144 tons of gold, enough to kickstart this new financial system. He believed that once the gold dinar took hold, not just African nations, but also many Muslim countries would follow suit. This would have weakened the grip of Western powers over African economies and, in effect, ended modern-day colonial influence. This wasn't the first time a leader had challenged the global financial system and faced severe consequences. Saddam Hussein, the former president of Iraq, made a similar move when he decided to sell oil in euros instead of US dollars. That decision put him at odds with the United States, which saw it as a direct attack on its economic dominance. Many believe it was one of the reasons he was eventually removed from power. A shift like this could have triggered a new kind of financial conflict, a currency war. Throughout history, nations have fought not just with weapons but with money, using trade and currency manipulation as tools to maintain control. If Africa adopted the gold dinar, it could have sparked a financial battle between economic giants, shaking up markets in the West, the Middle East, and beyond. Muammar Gaddafi's dream of a united Africa with its own gold-backed currency wasn't just an idea, it was a ticking time bomb for Western powers. But how did they even find out about it? Behind the scenes, high-level officials in the US were already keeping an eye on Libya. One of President Barack Obama's senior advisors, Sidney Blumenthal, sent an email to then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, with alarming news. Libya was sitting on a massive stockpile of 143 tons of gold and an equal amount of silver. This wasn't just wealth. It was the foundation of Gaddafi's plan to introduce a new currency that could break Africa's dependence on the US dollar and the euro. By March 2011, as tensions in Libya escalated, these reserves were quietly moved toward the country's southwestern border, near Niger and Chad. But it wasn't just the US that was concerned. Across the Atlantic, French President Nicolas Sarkozy had his own reasons to worry. Sarkozy saw Libya as an opportunity, both politically and economically. Gaddafi's Gold Dinar plan wasn't just a threat to Western currencies, it was also a direct challenge to French influence over its former African colonies. For decades, many West African nations had used the CFA franc, a currency tied to France. If Gaddafi succeeded in replacing it with an African-controlled gold-backed currency, France's grip on these economies would weaken. That was something Sarkozy wasn't willing to let happen, but his ambitions didn't stop there. Controlling Libya's oil production, boosting France's military standing, and strengthening his political position at home were also on his list of priorities. With Libya in chaos, he saw an opportunity to strike. Meanwhile, in Washington, Clinton was also weighing the risks. If Africa established its own strong currency, it would mark the end of an era where Western nations dictated economic terms to the continent. The balance of power would shift, and global financial systems would be shaken. The leaked email discussing Libya's gold and silver reserves revealed just how high the stakes were. For African nations, Gaddafi's plan was a bold step toward economic independence. For the West, it was a dangerous move that needed to be stopped. If you are still watching this video, it means you like content like this. Why not take out a second and hit that like button so that it reaches more Africans? Have you done that? Let us move on. Gaddafi's plan could have rewritten Africa's economic future. His idea, a single gold-backed currency known as the Gold Dinar. This wasn't just about money, it was about independence. Gaddafi wanted African nations to stop using the US dollar for oil sales and instead trade using their own wealth-backed currency. This move would have redirected oil revenues away from Western-controlled banks and straight into the hands of African governments. Countries like Nigeria, Egypt, Tunisia, and Angola were already considering the switch. If this plan had succeeded, Africa would have taken a huge step toward financial freedom, breaking free from economic dependency on Western nations. But before the Gold Dinar could become a reality, everything changed. In March 2011, NATO forces launched a military campaign in Libya, claiming it was to protect human rights and promote democracy. Many Libyans, influenced by Western media, believed these promises. But behind the scenes, something much bigger was at play. For over 42 years, Gaddafi had maintained power by uniting Libya's many tribes, offering free healthcare, nearly free gasoline, affordable education, and even a state-funded water system. His leadership had its critics, but it also provided stability. When Gaddafi was removed, Libya fell into chaos, and the dream of a gold-backed African currency was buried with him. He wanted to free Libya and the entire continent from reliance on Western-controlled banking systems. His solution? Backed by Libya's vast reserves of gold. This wasn't just an idea, it was already in motion. Several African nations were eager to join him, ready to ditch the US dollar for oil sales and embrace a currency that Africa controlled. If this had worked, it would have sent shockwaves through the global economy, cutting into the profits of Western financial institutions that had long benefited from Africa's dependence on their money. But before the dream could become a reality, Gaddafi's world unravelled. NATO forces, alongside Libyan rebels, launched a military campaign to remove him from power. As the fighting intensified, Gaddafi was forced to flee, eventually hiding in a drainage pipe on the outskirts of Sirte. When NATO-backed fighters found him, they opened fire, hitting him in the leg and back. Reports later emerged that someone from his own circle may have also shot him to prevent him from being captured alive. Moments later, Libya's longtime leader was dead. Videos of his final moments quickly spread across the internet, showing the brutal end of a man who had ruled for over 4 decades. His son, Muhammr Gaddafi, was also killed, and both were quietly buried just days later. Why did powerful entities really had to silence Gaddafi? Muammar Gaddafi wasn't just a leader, he was a game changer. His policies gave Libyans benefits that many people around the world, but what made life better for his people also made him a major threat to powerful interests outside Libya. Let's break down some of the things he did that upset his opponents. 1. Free electricity for everyone. Imagine never having to pay an electricity bill. Under Gaddafi, power was free for all Libyan citizens. No monthly bills, no hidden fees, just free electricity, courtesy of the state. 2. Nearly free gas, healthcare and education. Fuel was so cheap in Libya that filling up a car's tank cost less than a bottle of water. Healthcare and education were heavily subsidised, making them almost free for everyone. Whether you needed medical treatment or wanted to study, money was never an obstacle. 3. A massive gold reserve. Libya had a massive stockpile of gold, around 143 tons according to leaked reports. The same amount of silver was stored away too. If Gaddafi had used these reserves to back a new currency, Libya could have become one of the richest and most powerful nations in Africa, shaking up the global financial system. 4th, interest-free loans. Libyan banks operated under a unique system. Loans were given at 0% interest by law. People could borrow money without worrying about paying back extra, which made home ownership and business growth much easier. 5. Housing was a basic right. Gaddafi believed that every Libyan deserved a home. He even promised that he wouldn't move into his own house until every citizen had one first. Owning a home wasn't seen as a luxury, it was considered a basic right. 6. Government support for newlyweds. Starting a family in Libya came with government benefits. Newly married couples received financial assistance to help them build a home and settle into their new life. These policies made life comfortable for Libyans, but they also put Gaddafi on a collision course with powerful global forces that didn't want to see an independent Libya rise. Muammar Gaddafi wasn't just a leader, he was a man with big ideas that made some people love him and others see him as a serious problem. His vision for Libya and Africa didn't sit well with powerful forces, both inside and outside his country. But what exactly made him such a target? One of Gaddafi's most ambitious projects was the Great Man-Made River, an enormous irrigation system designed to bring fresh water from deep underground aquifers to Libya's cities and farmlands. This was no small feat. It was the largest irrigation project in the world, entirely funded by Libya itself. No loans from the IMF, no foreign aid, just Libya investing in its own future. But when NATO forces launched their military campaign, they didn't just go after Gaddafi, they deliberately bombed the irrigation system, along with the factory that produced the pipes for it. The destruction left millions of Libyans without access to fresh water. If their goal was to free the Libyan people, why take away their water? Gaddafi's influence wasn't limited to Libya. His push for a new Africa-wide currency had the potential to shake up global economics, reducing Africa's dependence on Western financial institutions. He was vocal about breaking free from external control, and that made him a threat to those who benefited from Africa's economic dependence. Despite his flaws, many Libyans and Africans saw Gaddafi as a leader who genuinely wanted his people to prosper. He often appeared on television, answering questions directly from the public. Some viewed him as a dictator, while others saw him as a revolutionary who wanted to shift power away from the West and into the hands of Africans. For over 40 years, Muammar Gaddafi was at the centre of Libya's political landscape, shaping the country's policies and commanding a fierce loyalty among his supporters. He wasn't just a leader, he was a symbol of resistance against foreign influence, advocating for African unity and economic independence. Under his rule, Libya underwent massive transformations. In 1977, he introduced a new socialist model, claiming to give power to the people while still maintaining control over the military and key government structures. His leadership style sparked both admiration and criticism, but one thing was certain: He had a vision for Africa that didn't align with Western interests. Throughout history, African leaders who sought to free their nations from outside control often faced violent opposition. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, Sir Abubakar Tafawa Balewa in Nigeria, and Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso all shared similar fates. Gaddafi's downfall seemed to follow the same pattern. Was it just another chapter in the long history of leaders who challenged global power structures? With Gaddafi gone, many questions remain. Did his dream of an independent African economy vanish with him? Was his removal truly for the benefit of the Libyan people, or was it a strategic move to maintain foreign control over Africa's resources? And more importantly, is there any leader today bold enough to pick up where he left off? If you enjoyed this video, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe.